Ina iwi, ina mana, ina reo, ina rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's always great to go last, isn't it, as you sit there nervously sort of rehashing and shredding and rehashing and shredding your speech as you listen to all of the other people that have gone before. And actually there were times tonight that I forgot to feel nervous. I was so entranced by the other speakers. So I'm honoured to be able to speak tonight. Thank you for letting me share my humble story with you, and I'm honoured to share the stage with such an august group. I'm from a generation born in the early 1960s, which means I was a child born in the 60s, not really a child of the 60s, which means I grew up with a vague sense of dissatisfaction that I'd missed out on something really cool. And by the time I got to really party in the late 70s and 80s, we were into sort of big hair and disco, which just made me look silly, and like my dance moves had been invented by John Cleese. I grew up in Wellington in a bog Irish Catholic family full of phobias about sin, Satan and sex. Apparently they're all connected in some way, or so the nuns told us. I could never figure that out. I'm a cousin to Michael Collins. Those of you who know your Irish history will know that he was the leader of the IRA at the time of the Irish partition. In our family we don't talk about politics very much, but when we do it can get pretty serious. I think that upbringing has given me something that I really value, and that's an innate sense of justice and fairness. And it's something that I've carried with me. And I think I also grew up, like many of you, in a time in our country where we were more egalitarian than we maybe are now. And in almost 30 years working as a social worker, I think one of the privileges, real privileges, that I've had is to witness many times situations in which people have had to show the strength of the human spirit. And I'm always deeply moved at people's ability to survive and endure and change in the face of all the odds. And I've often wondered, if I was in your shoes, would I be as brave? And speaking of bravery, I read somewhere recently that change comes about between a coalition of the brave and the fed up. And I don't know how brave I've been in my life, but I've certainly been fed up, and I'm fed up about a few things now. I'm going to be really disruptive and actually not use all my slides, so hopefully that doesn't annoy you too much. I don't know if this is the most disruptive act that I've ever been involved with, but it felt like it was timely to talk about it. In virtually the same week that our civic leaders told us that they intend to make asking for help on our streets of our city an illegal activity if you're poor or you're homeless, it's a good opportunity to tell you about an initiative that has disrupted 100 years of failure to address those issues in our city. Homelessness is one of the early warning signs in our community that our social support systems aren't working. And yet for the last 100 years, through our charitable approaches, we've managed a problem rather than solved it. And as one of the organisations that unintentionally worked in that way for 100 years, we're over doing charity as a means to achieve change. In the past, we've had soup kitchens, we've had drop-in centres, we've had night shelters. We've fed, clothed, showered, nursed people who are homeless and then turned them round and put them back on the street. We possibly have had the best dressed, the most well-fed, the sweetest smelling homeless people on earth, but they're still homeless at the end of it. So for all the time and effort and money that we spend on the problem, all we did is maintain people in homelessness. All we achieved was more homelessness. Our expectations were so low that we acted as if patching up people was okay. We assumed the problem was inevitable, that people chose to be homeless, or that they didn't want to, or that they couldn't change. One of the biggest issues that we confronted was that of crime committed by those who live in public places. We had a situation where we had people living on the street. They'd get arrested for committing usually public nuisance type crimes. Is that on a timer? All right, it's great, it's keeping pace with me. We had this kind of response. We had people who were offending in a public space. We had people who were arrested and taken to court. They'd normally go up to court and stand in front of the judge. They'd say nothing to the judge, get no opportunity to speak for themselves. They'd get a fine. They'd leave the court in the same bewildered state that they entered it, only to reappear back in the court a couple of weeks later with the same issue plus some unpaid fines. This would go on for months and months and months. In the end, the judge would get tired of that and he'd say, "Son, you're going to jail," and he'd send them to jail. In jail, they'd begin to change a little bit. A few months into jail, they'd be spat out back onto the street in the same old sad cycle. started again. The court became a revolving door, and we had to be able to do a better job than that. So sometimes in life you get lucky, and timing can be everything. You've got to be in the right place in the right time, or you've got to have other people in the right place at the right time. It creates the opportunity to do something. And at the end of 2008, I was lucky enough to spend a couple of days in Brisbane. I'd gone over to look at services for homeless people. And while I was over there, someone said to me, "Have you seen the homelessness court?" And I'd never even heard of it. And they said, "It's on today. Get yourself downtown and go and have a look at it." So I ran downtown and went to have a look at this court, saw it in operation, and spoke to the people who ran it. I was so impressed, I thought we have to have a similar thing in New Zealand to help deal with this problem. So back in New Zealand, as you can do in New Zealand because we're so small, I wrote to the Chief District Court Judge, and I said, Judge Johnson it was, and I said to Judge Johnson, I think we need to have this kind of court in Auckland. So, as you do in New Zealand, after a few meetings and a few exchanges of emails and so on, he agreed to that. And he then gave us the wonderful Judge Fitzgerald, who sits in the Auckland District Court. The downtown police became involved, they became a very strong ally, and they led a multi-agency working group to help set up the court. And in November 2010, Te Koti o Timatanga Hou, or the Court of New Beginnings, had its first sitting. It's really important to understand that the only additional resource that was required to set up this court was one social worker. So for the cost of one social worker, we were able to do this. Everybody else just needed to do their job. And that social work position was funded by 8 government departments who each contributed $10,000 a year. So how does the court work? It's pretty simple. It sits once a month in the district court. A person appearing there has to plead guilty. A plan is put around the person. It's coordinated by that social worker. It addresses the issues that lead them to be homeless, or that led them to be homeless in the first place. The social worker supports that person to carry out the plan, which is monitored by the court and until it's completed. So it's a process of both compassion and accountability. It's not therapy, but an opportunity to change. So, does it work? I don't know if these slides are going to follow me, but let's see. Yes. So, end of last year, we published an independent study into whether the court worked. And I'm sorry, I'm going to bore you with some statistics, and you've sat there for so long, but bear with me for a few minutes. We looked at 3 periods of time: 6 months prior to appearing in the court, the time during their court program, and 6 months afterwards. We looked at 4 things: number of arrests, we looked at the number of prison bed nights, their presentations to the Auckland Hospital Emergency Department, and their housing status. So, as you can see on the slide, the number of arrests went down. We looked at 21 people who had been through the court. The arrests went down by 2/3, and they stayed down 6 months afterwards. Oops, it's playing up. In terms of imprisonment, prison bed nights went down by almost 80% and then remained reasonably constant, but went down by 60% in the following 6 months. Got it. The visits to the emergency department reduced by nearly 20% in the time they were involved in the court, and by almost 60% in the 6 months afterwards. And the number of rough sleepers in that 21 went from 16 to 3 during the court program. In the following 6 months, reduced again to 2. Number of nights in Housing New Zealand accommodation from 0 to 1,185. An average length of stay, 237 days. It absolutely gave lie to the belief that people who are in this situation do not want to or cannot change. If the conditions are right, they will. But even more remarkable than those figures is the fact that the changes occurred in the first year of the court's operation. People who run these courts overseas tell us you'd never think to evaluate it within the first 2 years, because the systems that are in place that need to support the court to make it successful haven't been developed enough yet. So you'd never do it. But despite the fact that we didn't have those systems in place, people changed. And there have been some amazing stories along the way, some stories of courage and determination, strength of human spirit that I was talking about. Despite the odds, it's a story of hope. So, we thought that in order to deal with the issue of homelessness, what needed to happen was that homeless people had to change. They had to change their behaviours or their attitudes and aspirations. And while that's true, what really needed to change was 100 years of our attitudes and our beliefs about homelessness and about the people who are homeless and about how you respond best to it. So, does all of this challenge us in any way, shape or form? I think it tells us that we need to be really careful. It tells us how easily our assumptions, even those of us who work in this area of work, how easily our own assumptions and our preconceptions can lead us to further marginalise already marginalised people. And so that we end up creating divisions in our society. And I guess I'm talking wider than just homelessness here. I'm talking about poverty and inequality and exclusion in our communities in general. It's one of our biggest challenges as a city, and it's one I would ask you to take up. What do we need to do, and what attitudes do we need to have in order to make sure that our growing city does not become a divided city? And lastly, the court, I think, has taught me something about leadership itself. It's often the role of leader, in my experience, to make changes to systems or organisations or structures. And what the Te Kooti o Timatanga Hou initiative showed me is that sometimes when we're trying to change something, the first and most important and most essential thing we need to change is ourselves. And so now we have a new goal, and that goal is to end homelessness in our city. It's a goal that's shared by others. It's a goal that was shared by others exactly 1 week ago on this campus when 85 of us or so, including Sir Bob, slept rough outside here. To raise money, yes, and to raise awareness and to generate new ideas about how to address this problem. It's a goal that's shared by others. It sounds pretty lofty, but it's achievable. We can end homelessness in our city, but only if we change ourselves and only if we want to. Thank you.